Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Soika, the manager of Transform Professional Learning. We welcome you today to our live stream entitled Assessment to Empower Students in Project-Based Learning. Let's begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. In the midst of our joys and blessings, in our times of sorrow or doubt, we give you our praise, O Lord, a sign of our love to you. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Amen. Our live stream session today will focus on the importance of assessment through project-based learning. It's my pleasure to welcome our presenter, Andrew Miller, who is known to our district as he has been leading our Buck Institute PBL for the last number of years. Andrew is a thought leader, a learner, an educational consultant based out of Seattle who works internationally with school districts and who's involved with several organizations, including the Buck Institute of Education, as well as ASCD, where he has a new book, and Edutopia. So please join me in welcoming Andrew this afternoon.
Well, thank you very much for having me once again. We're back at it. Welcome to another fantastic year of project-based learning. And yes, this is our session on assessment to empower students in project-based learning. There will also be some small review of some PBL materials because there are some new updates that some may be interested in knowing about around project-based learning, and those will be coming very soon. I encourage you, if you are a tweeter, if you will, my handle is @BetaMiller. I know I have some colleagues here in the audience that will be tweeting out some ideas, and of course, there's the hashtag, ECSD Transform, I think is the hashtag. So feel free to follow there, add your comments. I always like to watch and see what people are doing. And it's a great way to be engaged kind of in the back channel, kind of lurking. So feel free to do that. As was already mentioned, you know a little bit about me. It's always nice to see returning faces and smiling faces. I'm like, I know people. This feels great. And yeah, I did actually just come out with a book, and it actually really relates to this content. It's called Freedom to Fail. So it's kind of, you'll see the tie-ins, I'm sure, but about how failure can be a learning opportunity and what has to be culturally in place, and actually also assessment practices in place that can support students. So you may have noticed that word empower in the title of the session, and I think that that's kind of the key word here. The word assessment isn't exactly the happiest word in the world. Usually when you say assessment or someone says assessment to you, you might not feel so great or go, oh boy, here we go, assessment, how exciting. Not usually, right? It carries a lot of baggage with it because, to be honest, the term assessment has been kind of hijacked by implementation models that aren't quite doing it right. You know, we say assessment and immediately our brains go, ooh, standardized testing, or you say assessment and you're like, I have so many of them. So there's a lot of baggage with it. So hopefully we can use this time and opportunity to maybe get rid of some of that baggage, maybe move forward from it, and try to find a way we can use assessment in a positive and happy light. And related to that, assessment is something that great teachers do naturally. It's something that great teachers always do. They're always assessing students and making decisions. Everyone can say that. I think it's just now kind of at a place now where we can kind of reclaim that and say, this is something we already do really well, and how do I do something better? So I'm going to start off with a video. It's from a series of videos from Edutopia. As mentioned, I do a lot of work with them, and they have a lot of great resources on project-based learning. And they came out with a video a while ago called 5 Essential Keys to Rigorous Project-Based Learning. I show that video often in the PBL 101 workshop because it's a nice little overview video, and it's a great video to show anybody if they want kind of a, what is PBL? Well, one of the things they go through is they show embedded assessment. That's like, what does that look like in projects? So I wanted to start off with that, with a video on that. And as you watch, we will have a short discussion afterwards on, as you see this, what's something that affirms your thinking around assessment? Something you're like, yes, I totally agree, and I do that well. And then also look for something maybe that's challenging for you. Something like, you know, I saw this in the video, but I struggle with that, or I'm not sure I agree with that. So affirmations and challenges.
Different than a traditional classroom, PBL is going to integrate assessment throughout the project. Because these projects are multi-week projects, you need to keep on top of students and build in opportunities to assess where they are and what they're learning as you go along.
From the minute a teacher introduces that learning target for the lesson or engages in strategic observation, we feel that the assessment process is in play.
It's not a test at the end of the week or the end of a unit. You're doing a lot of small check-ins with the students to see where they're at and to see that they're growing along. So some examples of formative assessments that I use in my classroom is FIST to 5. So 5 is I feel really good about this learning target. I'm learning what I need to in class today. A 0 is I have nothing.
You really have to know what kids know and don't know. That can often determine what next steps need to be put into place in order to support or differentiate the learning for the kids in their classroom.
You saw another form of assessment which we call a quick check, or checking for understanding, and that's sort of the thumbs up, I get it, sideways, I'm not quite sure, or thumbs down, no, I don't get it. And that's for them to reflect, but it's also for us to do a check for their understanding.
It's just sharing some of the responsibilities for assessment with those who are most involved with the project. So you give students the opportunity to assess themselves. You give them the opportunity to assess their teammates.
We find that some of the most important and useful feedback is when kids can offer it to each other.
So typically in a PBL unit, the culminating event is what all the students and the teacher are working toward. So usually this involves inviting community members, inviting other teachers, inviting parents to the classroom, or maybe you even do it in the evening and you present what the students have learned, whether it's the final product, something that they created, whether it's a solution to a problem facing the community. So it's usually a big deal, and the teachers should take advantage of that being a big deal, because the students are very proud to present what they've learned. It really becomes an event where students are showcasing all that they've learned through this big project and their plans for how they're going to pursue it further.
So that, again, is a video about kind of embedding assessment. You also saw links to kind of other ones. So if you do want to search on your own and find them on Edutopia, they are available for you to share and watch. But let's return to kind of this discussion question. At your tables, talk about, again, something that affirmed what you saw up there and something that maybe challenged you. We'll give a few minutes for that. Welcome back from our conversations. I heard some good stuff. Some things I heard when I walked around and I listened were things around, that it's done along the way. That's something that I totally believe in. And I actually heard a couple comments. I think that's why assessment has baggage, is because traditionally it's always thought of as the thing at the end, not the things along the way. And that's why we kind of have that negative connotations. And then I heard some challenges too. I said, I know some people and I myself struggle with doing this in a manageable fashion. Like, really, if I'm assessing along the way, that sure is a lot of assessing. That kind of scares me a little bit. Some other people mentioned one of their challenges was getting students to truly self-assess or peer assess effectively. I think that definitely can be a challenge, right? Because I know there's some situations where some students go, I'm fine, and do they really look at the criteria and really go, no, really, is there a way to improve? And so those are some challenges, and I want to echo that. So to be transparent, assessment in PBL was the thing I did horribly when I first started projects. I was the worst assessor. And I don't think that's like a fault of my own. I just think about when anybody who enters the teaching field at any time really doesn't get those chops, those skills to assess. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like when I left my CERT program, my master's, I didn't know what I was doing. Like, you thought you knew what you were doing, and then you like, are you assessing your students? And you go, what? I don't know what that means. Like, what does that look like? So I was not good at this. I trusted students too much. And by that I mean I'd launch a project, they'd be really into it, and then as it progressed, I'm like, they're fine. Were they really? And I couldn't tell you. And so then when I would get to the end, I'd get a real mixed bag of project products, like a real mixed bag. Some were great, some were not. So that was an area for me that I went, wow, man, if I don't improve my assessment practices, my projects are not gonna go effectively. So you're right. I mean, that's why assessment is so important in project-based learning, right? You can't do effective PBL unless you do great assessment practices. You can't do it. You can't just trust the process and hope that it happens. There are intentional moments along the way that you've got to do to help students out and figure out what you need to do as a teacher. At the same time, though, I think that if you're doing great assessment practices, you're actually creating time for PBL to happen. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Before we get to some kind of meatier content around assessment, which actually is my new favorite thing, I'm reading everything about assessment, and I love assessment, and I know that sounds really kind of nerdy, but I really do love assessment. I really do love talking about it and learning about it. We're going to do a little bit of a kind of a review here, though. Sort of a review, sort of not review. For some of you, it may be a review. For some of you, it may be a refresher, or for some of you, you may be like, I got this. Regardless, most of you in this room are familiar with this graphic. I feel like most everyone out there in the ether have seen this graphic at one time or another around project-based learning. And this comes again from the Buck Institute. And it also comes from an article they first wrote, which was, it started with the 7 essentials for project-based learning, and then it was the 8 essentials for project-based learning, right? So, because things always change, right? That's just how it is. Times are changing, so does PBL. Well, I'm sure you've also noticed that there are a lot of people out there that are claiming to be doing project-based learning. Like, you can Google PBL, and then your screen will fill up with all kinds of websites and resources. And I'm sure you've realized that in your search, you may have clicked on something. And you go, ooh, a PBL project on that. That sounds interesting. And in that clicking, you go, that's not PBL at all, right? I'm sure many have experienced that. People say they're doing PBL and putting stuff out there, but it's not quite that, or it's just not fantastic PBL. So there's actually been a push, and the Buck Institute for Education, along with other PBL thought leaders, got together, asked teachers, surveyed people, did some research, and said, well, what is the gold standard? Like, what is, if we were to like make some of the best PBL projects ever, what would that look like and sound like and feel like? And so they took the essential elements that you saw that graphic on, and now we've created kind of the essential components of project-based learning. I have a link up here that you can see to an article that I added just kind of at the last minute. I know this article has been circulating. People are tweeting it out, they're sending it on emails. But so now we've moved to kind of these different components of projects that we believe, and I think most would believe, really call for high quality PBL. So what I want you to do, this is kind of a refresher, but also kind of a new thing. I want you to take both of these side by side, and again, there's a slide on it, and I have it right here. Compare and contrast at your tables. What are you noticing? What stayed? What is maybe slightly changed? What is new? And then I'll kind of highlight some of those major changes in a minute. So we'll take a minute, compare, contrast, draw lines, if you will. Do whatever you need to compare, contrast what's going on now. It used to be 8 essentials, and now we've got the gold standard. Okay, welcome back. Thank you for having your conversations. And I encourage you, if you're not done with your conversation, to continue it, afterwards and kind of look at some of these things. Some things that I heard, and again, as I was walking around, I'm sure that you said in your conversations. You'll notice that reflection has its own place now. It's got its own sacred place. I like to call it that, because we know how powerful it is. John Dewey says, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And so I think that really honors that reflection. And again, when I talk about my first mistakes, when I thought about all my projects in the time, I would build in reflections, but when something happened, I'd be like, oh, we don't have time for the reflection now, just move on. And I think that was totally a disservice. I think that that's something that when I reflect, on my practice, I think, you know what, I really should have really kept that time sacred. That's part of the assessment process, but it's also just an important part. Everyone needs reflection. Everyone. Self-reflection all the time. And that could be done just even sitting and thinking, or writing, or maybe I know some people do video logging, for reflective purposes. So that could be something you do. Again, it's not just in-depth inquiry, it's sustained inquiry, the idea that we're taking this inquiry and we're sustaining it for some time. That's why we say a project is anywhere from 10 to 15 or more contact hours, right? Because we want to sustain the questioning, sustain the inquiry, not just one day of it or one major question. Yes, instead we've moved from public audience to public product, because there's a lot of ways to make something public. It doesn't have to have, in that video you saw kind of a big celebration and kind of thing, but sometimes we can't always do that. But sending a letter to a government official is also making it public. Putting it on the internet is also a great assessment thing that you can do and have, like, even if you do it synchronously or asynchronously. I know that when I had students, for example, write short stories, I managed to get an author to comment on their work, but of course she was very busy and she was unable to come in. So I said, well, would you be able to virtually do that? And again, that was a form of critique and revision too. So you'll notice critique and revision is along the way for improving our products. That's a newer piece there, and that we believe it's important for students to be able to give and receive great feedback to each other. We've also, it's not just voice and choice, but student voice and choice. We really wanted to emphasize the choice and the voice isn't just me, it's also with the student. The student has control over what products they want to produce, as well as how they spend their time. You'll also see that at the center, key knowledge, understanding, and success skills are in there, right? So we've removed that kind of, I guess you would maybe call it antiquated label, 21st century skills, because we're kind of in the 21st century now, into more success skills and understandings. And these come from your outcomes, and maybe not directly from your outcomes, but just things you want students to learn. And notice that that's at the center. We really want to emphasize that this is about learning, not just about fun. We want there's got to be clear learning outcomes and clear criteria for success in a project. And of course, the new one that I'm personally excited about is authenticity. Yay, I love that. I mean, anybody who's done PBL knows the more authentic you can make the project, the better. And there are a lot of ways to make a project authentic, from personally authentic, like I really care about this, to maybe solving a real world issue or problem or exploring it. Those are all very authentic things. But that is a new place that has its own sacred place, because we know how important some of the best projects are very authentic. So those are just some of the highlights that you'll see there. Because this is, I guess, PBL 5000.0, you know, things are always changing, but we understand, I think the Buck Institute and anybody doing PBL understands that we need to revise and we need to get feedback as we improve. So this is just a model of that. And so who knows what will happen maybe in the next few years. Maybe we'll get a whole new graphic, right? And something might change. Who knows? We'll find out. So we're going to jump into some of this content around assessment. Now, I'm not going to overdo this graphic here. I'm not going to overdo this. Why? Because everyone is pretty competent in these terms. Most people now, when you ask them what is the difference between formative and summative, most people could give you an answer. It's very important, and most people have at least read something or maybe gotten some formal professional development on it. And I'm sure you've seen this. I think where I like to at least push this, though, is that as you look at this and you think about the purpose of it and when it's administered and what it is, there are some things up there that are probably easier to do than others. So I want to bring one out right now. You'll notice on this graphic, where is the word grade? It is on the summative assessment component. It is not on the formative assessment component. So anytime somebody ever asks me, Andrew, are formative assessments graded? No, they are not. They are not graded. Formative assessments are not graded. No, you don't grade them. No, you don't grade formative assessments. Don't grade formative assessments. You can't grade formative assessments. And I say it over and over and over again, and people still go, but I really wanna. And I think I know why. And I know you're going to be working with Myron Dweck, who does some really great work on grading and some very important work, and I love his stuff. But I just kind of want to preview that right now. I think I know why this grading thing is such a personal, cultural thing. For too long, grading has been used as a hammer. As in, I will use this tool, this hammer, to make kids do things. I will use this tool. And if you will do the work, for it is worth points, and it has a grade with it. Now do it. And some of our kids respond to that, and some of our kids do not. So imagine, you're a teacher, and that is something you're used to doing, and I did it, absolutely. I confess, I did. I used grading as a hammer. To be honest, because that's how I was taught. You know, everyone was taught that way. Everything was graded, or you didn't even know what was graded, and so I used it as a hammer. And imagine, you have this hammer, and that's how you get kids to do work. And then somebody comes along and says, you no longer have the hammer. What are you left with? That's how it feels. Think about it. You're taking a tool away that I've used for years, and now I'm left with not necessarily nothing, but it's gone. And I think that's why when you talk about why don't we grade formative assessment, and you no longer use that to get kids to do work, why people are really honestly scared, because you've actually taken a tool in teaching and learning away from them. And so I think we need to honor that it's not coming from a I'm a bad person place, but more of a that's what I've always done and I don't know anything else. But this is why I bring that up. If we really want students to feel like they can make their PBL projects awesome and they can create great work and fail and make mistakes and learn from that and then create amazing final products that they publicly present, well, then they can't be punished in the process of learning. They can't. So when we talk about assessment practices to empower students, we actually might be disempowering students if we're grading everything, because now everything is worth it, and now I can't make mistakes, and now I can't take risks, right? If you told me everything that I've done in my classroom is the way it is, and I can't take risks, I'm not going, and I'm graded, I'm not going to take risks. I'll be honest, I'm going to freak out. Anybody would, right? So I think that's kind of why I like to bring that out. I think the other challenge with this one is taking some of the load off of yourself. When we talk about assessments, we often think of it as a teacher job. And you're absolutely right. You know your content, so you definitely should assess your students. But I would also encourage you to try and have a social life. And by that I mean stop staying all the time and assessing and grading everything. There's nothing in teaching role job that says one must assess everything. That's why you have other students in your classroom. That's why they have themselves so they can self-assess. And that's also why you connect with public audience members. So finding ways to shed that load from yourself in the assessment process. Again, I firmly believe that assessment should not just be done to students. It's not just I will assess you, but assessment is just something that's part of our classroom. I assess, you assess yourself, we assess each other. It's just an ongoing process in that. And so related to that, I believe assessment, I like to use metaphors a lot and analogies. It's just kind of how I roll. I think being a former English teacher, I think it kind of helps. I think assessment should be more of a photo album, not just one snapshot. A photo album, so that when students get to the end of a project, they see the journey, right? The parents see the journey. You see the journey. If I just take one photo, I don't know what the rest of the journey was, right? If I just take one photo at the end, I don't know where you were and how you got to the place that you were. So thinking more along that. And who doesn't love a good photo album? Like, who doesn't? I love, like, my friend's wedding photo album. Like, we love to see the more formal ones, like the one where they're, in the ceremony, and that's kind of near the summative, right? When if you could think of the summative as putting the ring on and then the celebration afterwards, right? But what about those really candid moments before the ceremony? Like the one where the bride is getting her makeup put on, for example. That beautiful. Those images are just as powerful as, and now you are married. I think so. So thinking about that and how can you honor every moment of the journey of your project, not just the end. So it's more of a photo album. So a couple of key things to talk about formative assessment specifically and take this to the next step is to demystify it. And by that I mean sometimes when you think of formative assessment, you just think of that check for understanding. And yes, formative assessment includes checking for understanding, but it's also these other pieces. It is a way of thinking. It is a system. It is not simply, I will check and see how my students are doing. For example, you need to know where you're going. If you don't know where you're going, you won't know what you're assessing. I mean, that makes sense, right? Like, if I don't know what to assess, we have a problem. And I was working with a teacher, and she had all these great strategies for checking for understanding, like really cool ones. And I was like, I'm going to steal that idea. I love it. And then we had a conference, and I said, so I noticed you did an exit ticket. Very common check for understanding. I love it. I love your exit ticket. What were you looking for? I was checking to see whether or not they've learned, she said. And I went, that's great. So what were you looking for? Well, I was looking, whether or not they learned the concept. Yes, yes, yes. What concept? Like, really, really, really tell me which one. And that was a challenge because it's really about being like a laser. What did you really, really want? Like a laser, knowing what you want. You can't check for understanding unless you know that. We also know that feedback is a super important part of formative assessment, right? Anybody who's read Hattie's work and loves Hattie's work knows the power of feedback and how it informs instruction. And then, of course, the feed forward, right? Now that you have checked for understanding, you've given feedback to students, what are you doing next for them? What are you doing? So this is really a cycle. It's not just a one-moment thing, and I want to be really clear about that. So, checking for understanding, how am I doing? You guys, everyone in this room and in the live stream have gotten a lot of great PD around that. You've gotten some great work from Dylan Willem on his embedded formative assessment work. These are all some of the strategies that he lists in there. And I want to say continue to use these strategies. They're fantastic. Use them in your PBL projects. They're great, quick check-ins. I like these ones a lot because they're not intensive. They're not like teacher intensive, right? I can just do them and pull them out of my, your Batman teacher toolkit and be like, sweet, let's do some hot seat right now, or let's just do some, or mini whiteboards, like go, go, go. So a lot of our checks for understanding are what you might call on the spot, like just in the moment of teaching. And those are just as powerful as more formal ones. So when we talk about checks for understanding and formative assessment inside of a PBL project, we are talking about these quick ones that allow you, the teacher, to really shift immediately as needed. That with-itness that master teachers have where they just go, oh, we just did the whiteboard, quick, I need to do something. You know, like that's fantastic. There are, of course, more formal formative assessments that you can use in a project. Now, something I want to bring up in there. So you'll notice the dreaded word tests are in there. Oh my goodness, he said the T word, tests. Oh no, don't say the T word, Andrew. Actually, related to that, I want to say something about that. So you know that the final products that students turn in will probably be the summative assessments, probably. That's very true. I really encourage you in your projects not to give choice in products, for example. Maybe they're choosing between a PowerPoint, a podcast, and a speech. I'm just throwing that out there. I am not going to assign that as part of the project and give them a standardized test. I'm not going to do that. That actually is doesn't really make much sense, right? Shouldn't that assess what they know in that product? It should. But I hear what you're saying, Andrew. You know, okay, Andrew, that's all well and good, but that is also a magical place of fairies and unicorns. We don't live in that, Andrew. My students still have to take standardized tests. They absolutely do. I hear you, okay? Whether that's a provincial piece, whether that's, like we have AP and IB, all of those more standardized things, I get you. I'm going to honor that. But I encourage you to use them more as formative tools instead of summative. Use them as checks along the way. If you teach an area of content, why not grab a more traditional test? Do you know that tests actually are good for like coding and analysis? They're actually really good at that, better than some other things. And again, we've used all of these strategies up here before. Today, though, I'm going to focus on these three at the top here. I'm going to focus the ones in bold: oral language, questioning, and written language. I'm going to focus on those as great tools, again, to empower students to learn, not do the learning for them. Assessment runs the risk of me doing all the work and the student doing nothing. So we want to move away with that, right? If I'm doing all the work, they're not going to learn anything. So how do I move to a place where students are actually empowered to use the assessments? I think these three are actually a good focus piece for you. Now, related to that, feedback is not enough, right? Just getting feedback is not enough. We need to know what you're giving feedback on. For example, I'm sure we've all experienced something where all of a sudden somebody comes to us and says, here is, you get an A on your paper, an A. Or you get a B minus. On what? What is that? That's the feedback that you're getting. Or, I'll be honest, check plus. Okay? But I don't even know what to do with that. Like, that's feedback that is unanchored. There is no anchor. Okay? And we also know that, so we need to know what we're assessing, right? And related to that, we need to know what we're giving feedback on. Here's a tip. Don't do feedback near the end. Don't. Stop it. Stop waiting. I don't understand why we do this. Like, and this is coming from a normal English teacher thing. Okay, the epic peer review. You know what I'm talking? You know which one I'm talking about? Like, it's right before the final paper, right? And like, okay, guys, it is peer review time. I have a list of 15 things to look for. Go. And it's like, fix the thesis and the grammar and the organization and the catchy ending and the blah blah. You know, like, and poor kids. Now they're being asked to, either I'm going to assess it or they're going to do it. And then you know what happens? I'm overwhelmed. Think about it. Really? 15 things? Stop it. I'm going to tell you to stop it now. Instead, I'm going to say, here's what you should do. If you did a lesson on thesis and you had your students write a thesis, as one does, why not give feedback then? I mean, it sounds kind of obvious, but we don't. We do it then, because then you don't even have to wait. That's, I think, a problem why students don't like feedback, because it's not given to them at the right time, and it's also just wait to the end, where they get a giant paperback and it's got red marks all over it. And I'll be honest, imagine, let's say you had to produce something, and no one's telling you early on that maybe you made a mistake, and then 2 weeks pass and you turn it in, and you get something handed back to you and they say it's all wrong. That's not going to feel very empowering, is it? Now, it's going to feel very disempowering. You're going to be like, well, forget this. I'm not doing it. And I wouldn't blame you. So really think about that. How can you, instead of just waiting to the end, how can you do it along the way for students so they can actually, use it and improve their work? That's super important. Now, related to that, there's also an article that's out, in addition to the gold standards of projects, there's also the what you might call gold standard of teaching practices, as in what are some of the characteristics and attributes of great PBL teachers. So if you want to read that article later, go for it. But I'm actually going to highlight how this work right now is really addressing two very specifically. It addresses the fact that great PBL teachers should assess student learning all the time, and two, it addresses the fact that great PBL teachers engage and coach their students along the way. Right? If I would think of anything about any teacher, this is the image I always think about. When we talk about scaffolding, when we talk about coaching kids, it's just like when you learn to ride a bike, right? You have your parent or your guardian or someone side by side with you saying, this is how you do it, this is what you're doing well, good job, keep up, I'm noticing that you're struggling with this, and eventually they remove the lovely training wheels and then you're free to go. And that's the same thing here. How can we be more like that and help students and take off the training wheels and run with it in a great project? So, feedback. This is super, 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 super important in the sense of, I feel like I've said that the entire time. This is super important. It's all super important. Remember, feedback should cause thinking, not do the thinking for the students. When I was taught how to give feedback, it would look something like this. I would get a piece of paper, or maybe even talk with the student, and I would say, this is wrong, this is how you do it. Guess what? I've caused no thinking. In fact, I've done the thinking for the student. There's no thinking there. So really think about that. How could you use feedback to cause kids to think, not just do? Because that is how they will learn. If you simply tell them what to do, they're not necessarily learning that. They're just going, okay, and they do it. But if you give them the right type of feedback to make them, you know that funny look that kids, this one? You know that where you know the wheels are turning? That is the type of feedback we need to be giving our students, not the other kind. And I'm totally transparent. I'm guilty. When I first started this work, we're not great at giving feedback to cause thinking. We're great at giving feedback to say, hey, this is how you do it. So related to that, we also know that feedback needs to be specific. This is a funny little joke. I'm sure many of you have pets, right? And we use that term, bad dog, all the time. Now let's pretend for a minute that a dog could actually talk, right? And you say, bad dog. I have a feeling the dog would say, bad dog what? Like, what did I do wrong? Not specific, right? Like, just, you're a bad dog. Well, I feel like that dog would say, I need some more specific feedback, thank you very much. I need some, like, what is not good? Did I go outside and stay outside too long, right? Did I maybe go to the bathroom in a place that I wasn't supposed to? Because this is important, specific feedback, right? That's the only way kids are going to change and learn from you. So how are you giving more specific feedback? And Grant Wiggins, who recently passed away, unfortunately, it was kind of a pretty shakable, pretty intense loss to the community because it came very quickly, and he's such a thought leader in this work. I knew Grant and I knew his work, and one of his articles that he talks about are these kind of 4 keys of assessment and thinking about feedback, like when you do feedback. It's got to be timely. So that relates back to what I was saying. Why are we waiting to the end? If you don't give it early, it won't empower students to learn, because now it's close to the end and it means nothing, right? Who cares? And to be honest, do I really want to put in all the work to correct my stuff? Probably not. Does need to be specific. This is why when I talked about if you don't know what you're assessing, you won't get there. So you need to have clear things and criteria that you're assessing along the way, right? That way it's specific and they can do something with it. So not just, here's an example, use more expression in your writing. What does that even mean? Like, that's really broad. A little vague, it doesn't really help me too much. So you've got to be more specific. And that's also related to this one, understandable. If a student does not understand the feedback, they will not use it. Which is probably why a lot of elementary teachers don't do a lot of written feedback, because they know that if I write it down in teacher speak and give it to a kindergarten, it's probably not going to do what it needs to do, right? It's more that on-the-spot feedback through that oral language feedback, right? But that doesn't mean that secondary teachers can't do that either. I think that's just as important. And of course, it has to be actionable. Like, I got to be able to do something with it, okay? I've got to be able, and that one I think may be a bit of a challenge for some of us. How do I make my feedback actionable? Again, not me doing the action for them, but them doing the action. An example of that is I know some teachers, instead of just telling students that this was an error and this is why it's an error, they just note errors. They prompt students and they say, this is an error. And it causes students to go, it's an error. Why is it? What's wrong? That's a different way of causing thinking than saying, this is wrong, fix it. Why don't you have the student figure out what's wrong and fix it? Isn't that good learning? I feel like it is. I feel like it's good. So related to that, you can give lots of types of feedback. You can give feedback about the project task, like the task they're doing. Okay, let's say a student is engaged in something and you have a criteria of what you need students to do. Maybe it's a list of steps, or you're doing even a lab inside of the project. It's okay to give feedback to students and say, you know, you're going to want to reread that list of questions and check your work to see, you know, that you've got all those points. Again, I'm not telling them what they're missing, how they're missing everything, and what's wrong. I'm saying, you know what, I want you first to go look for yourself. Because if that student goes and looks themselves, they're going to go, oh, what am I missing? Oh, okay, no, that part's good, but what am I missing? So that might be about the task. It may also be about the content, right? So there's content you want students to learn, and you might give feedback on that. And sometimes, again, these questions are in the form of just declarative sentences or questions, right? Questions are just as good. So maybe a student is struggling with this math problem, and I know in my head that it's the FOIL method. Now, instead of walking the student through the entire FOIL method, and we've already learned that, I might just say to them, did you use the FOIL method? Did you use it? And they might go, I don't know. Why don't you go check and see? That's a different, again, that's prompting the students to think and not me doing the thinking for them. You may also give feedback about success skills. Part of PBL is great collaboration, right? You want students to work in teams. But sometimes our students don't do so well working in teams, and so we have to give feedback on that. Non-judgmental, but just clear feedback. Like, instead of, you're not collaborating well, which is not very clear and a little judgmental, I might say, hey, in the teams today, I noticed you put your head down and stopped listening to your team. Let's talk about that. Why did that happen? Why do you, how do you think your team members would feel when you did that? See, I'm not being judgmental. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm just saying, I saw this. I have evidence of this. And notice how specific it is. Super specific about that. And I'm bringing attention to an action. And maybe the student says, oh, you know, I didn't mean to. I was just really tired. Oh, okay, no problem. But do you see how that communicated? They thought you weren't listening to them. So let's talk about that. You can also give feedback about the person. Now, this is an important little caveat here. I think it's important that we lift up kids when they do personal success, when they're personally successful. Feedback about that, right? Kids need to know when they're on the right track, just as much as they need to know what they need to work on. So if you see a student, they're persevering, why not give them a great little piece of feedback about this? Like, I noticed that it took you a while to do this assignment, but you kept doing it. I noticed you also had some errors, but you kept persevering, and I want to thank you so much for putting in 110% today. That's great. I am not saying this, though. Wow, you are so smart. Don't ever say those words. And there's a reason behind that. It actually works against you whether you think so or not. So I'm never going to say to a student, well, you're so smart. No, I'm going to point to specific things of maybe what shows their achievement. You included great facts. All your facts were super clear. Your way of presenting was very, very persuasive and used a lot of techniques, right? That's what I'm going to say. I'm not going to say, wow, your presentation shows you how smart you are. No, because maybe they are. Like right now, you're so smart. You are so smart. And you're going, I am so smart. I am so smart. I am so great at this. I am so proud of myself. And then you get to a new situation, maybe down the road, in which you're not succeeding and you're struggling, you're failing. Because that happens, right? We're good at some things, we're not at other things. And then I got this thing in my head, what, I'm so smart? I'm so smart? But I'm not, because I'm failing. So it actually may work against it and may actually not help kids. It may actually disempower. This is super, super true of our, maybe you would call them our A students, our high achievers, right? They think they've been conditioned that they are the perfect gems, so anytime a struggle comes in the way, they go, oh my gosh, I must not be smart. So try not to use that language. Feedback about the person is great, but don't work against it and not build a growth mindset. I think so don't use the words smart. It may actually work against you whether you think so or not. Now, related to this feedback thing, I'm giving all these examples of what it could look like and sound like and feel like, but let's get real. Educators, teachers, we have too much to do. Too much to do. We always have there's never enough time. There's never enough time to get it all done. And sometimes in this, I love to bring up this story because this is pretty true for many of us. How many of us have what I call the epic feedback weekend? You know which one I'm talking about? The one where you have all of these assignments and you go home and you make that pot of coffee on Saturday morning and you tell your significant other, your husband or wife, listen, I'm going to need all day to do, you take the kids to the park or whatever, and you spend 8 hours, right, giving feedback. Don't. Stop. You don't need to do that. I actually encourage you not to, because what usually happens is you're sitting there writing forever and ever and writing epic essays on this stuff on every little thing, and again, you're giving feedback on too much, and that's why it's taking you so long. And then you bring it back to school, and you are so proud of yourself, and you pat yourself on the back, and you go, I am the best teacher in the world. I spent all this time giving feedback to students. They are going to love and appreciate me. And then what happens to that feedback? This is what happens to that feedback. Oh, you know, either that or it's on the table, and they go, whatever, and they just gonna, right? Right? They do that, and again, here's why. It's too much. You're giving feedback on everything. Right? And maybe you don't even need written feedback. I do believe in written feedback. I think it is important, but try not to all the time. Try to just have those immediate moments of feedback and use self-assessment. It's important to give written feedback, but if it's too much, kids aren't going to use it, and it will not empower them to learn. And again, if you wait to the end and you give all of this stuff, it's going to be too much and too overwhelming. So instead, think of small check-ins, small moments of feedback where they can take one thing and apply it immediately. Okay? That's when you want to do written feedback. In addition, now you're actually saving yourself time because you're not spending all weekend. You can actually have a social life on the weekend. Maybe a little bit, right? Maybe see your family. So try that. It's actually good. It's just a healthy thing to do instead of, it's not just a good idea, but it's healthy. It's just a healthy thing. So some other tips on that. Around how do I avoid the garbage pan, like, you know, where all the feedback goes. Focus on errors rather than mistakes. There's a difference between an error and a mistake. A mistake, right, is you know something, you just made a boo-boo. That happens, right? Like, I taught the FOIL method, right? And I know it in my heart of hearts, and I've done it, and it's here, and then I just made an error. Like, I forgot to do that. I did it inside. Why did I do inside? First outside, inside, last. Okay, for those non-math people out there. All right, but I did that. Oh, bummer. You don't need to do anything about that, do you? Like, you really don't. You just go, what's going on? You don't need to write an epic feedback about the FOIL method. The child knows. You're just quickly addressing it. You're not going to take a lot of time for that. So, but now there are errors. That means the child actually has a learning gap there. There's something going on. There's something, if there's no synapses firing, that is the type of time to give feedback. That is the time to give really good, authentic feedback. Errors, not necessarily mistakes, right? If you focus on every mistake, you will never get done with anything. So focus on errors and really know. Find patterns in errors. So as you assess along the way in a project and you're seeing, wow, this group of kids is struggling with this skill, or just these kids over here, or this half of the class, or maybe the whole class is struggling with something. That's where you're going to focus your feedback, right? You're not going to focus it on these little moments. Those you're going to address really quickly. But the more epic ones you might look for, that's when you're going to jump in and go, we need some really good specific feedback, because I'm not going to give feedback on something that kids don't need. If kids don't need the feedback on something, then I'm not going to do it, right? If they've got this, I'm going to focus on the more targeted and global errors in my classroom. So related to that, we're going to practice that right now. I want you to look at, and this, for those watching at home, we have a lovely green, ours is green here, but it's this sheet that looks like a bunch of, there's initials, and it's called the Who Am I Draft Essay, and pretend that this is I guess maybe a major, I'm going to call it this, a major formative assessment, like a benchmark in the middle of a project, right? We're going to get to a more epic piece, but this is like the draft, like a major draft. You'll notice that it's focused on multiple learning outcomes. This is what's called an error analysis tool. So every little initial that you see on there is an error. It means the student didn't quite get that concept. Here's what I'd like you to do as a table. Let's pretend you were doing this project, you were doing this essay, you get this draft back, and you're identifying the errors. What are you going to do? What is your job as an instructor? How are you going to help your kids? If you were doing this, what would you do? Talk about that now. Welcome back. This is a really fun exercise to do, actually. I encourage you in your teams, grade level teams, to try something out, and also to try this out in a project of your choice. It'll help you work smarter. That's really what this is. So some of the things I heard, like, for example, immediately everyone saw supporting evidence, period 4. Everyone's like, what is going on? Like, wow, that's class, what's going on there? And I heard a lot of good things. Some people said, well, looks like we need a whole new lesson a new type of strategy to engage them, right? We're not going to reteach the same way. That's called insanity. Doing the same thing and expecting a different result, right? Like, I'll teach just the same way. I'm like, well, they already didn't respond to it, so we better try something else. So re-engaging them in some sort of activity, something new for them, maybe that. But other people said, we really need to dig deeper with period 4. I'm also seeing in general, lots more issues, just like more in general, not just supporting evidence. What's going on there? And there could be a number of things. Do I have a lot of, maybe there's a lot of IEPs in that classroom. Maybe there's some behavioral issues. Maybe the culture of the classroom is struggling right now. Maybe we have some ELL students and that's getting in the way of some of the language learning. Like, there's many things that could be going on here. And it's not really about what is going on, but using this and going, I wonder what's going on, and I wonder what I need to do to really help and make this work better for my kids. And in that case, how am I going to help that? I also heard some people said, well, period 3 is a joy. Yes, that's your planning. Don't worry. Wouldn't it be great if that was true? But there also are those classes that go easier than some, and they're ready to move on. The other thing that I noticed some people did is they looked for specific students. So for example, I think there's JC and AA. They went there and they went, oh my gosh. So that's also a red flag. That means major intervention needs to happen. Maybe it's something outside of my control. Maybe there's something going on at home that I don't know about or outside of school, right? Because that happens, and that impacts learning, and it's very important to know that. So I may need to do some major interventions with some students because what's happening in the classroom, it's just not working for that student. So I need to figure out what's going on for specific students and what I'm going to do. Some other things I heard were, obviously, small group instruction. I also hear this sometimes. Should I just forget about it? As in, no, I mean really, like, tense consistency. I'm just looking at that right now, for example. You may or may not. You may go, do I really have time right now? Right? Is it super important right now? I have a year. Do I want to maybe just like wait? And I'm going to worry about that later. Sure. A lot of this, and I use this joke, it's not the best one, but it's kind of like triage. I mean, it really is. It's like, what do I really need to focus my time on? And I look at this and I go, we are doing supporting evidence, and that is what I'm going to do. You know what I mean? So this is really about figuring out what your priorities are. So this, if you do something like this, it may actually make you change your priorities in the middle of a project, and that's okay. That's okay. If you decide, you know what, I'm not going to worry about tense consistency. I'm not going to worry about this concept. We're doing it later anyways. Who cares? We're not going to worry about it. That's fine. That is a fine decision that you can make as a teacher. It just means that you're making your priorities and figuring out how you want to do it. So consider how you might use this in a project for a major formative assessment, a major one. Not a quick little fist-to-five thing you talk about, like more of a written draft, or maybe it's some drawings or screenplay or a mini presentation, something that's more meaty, that's hitting multiple learning outcomes. And I've seen this done for anything upwards of 3 learning outcomes to maybe this many. So you can do it with just 3 learning outcomes too. I think that's really a powerful tool for you and how you work smarter in your project. Because I'll be honest, one thing that when I think about this, and the reason this ties back to the empowering thing, is the student engagement thing. If I do something like this, or assess anything for that matter, and I find that half the class is not getting something, because that happens, right? The worst thing I can do to that class, I think, is to do whole group instruction. If I assess half the class, and the whole class, and half the class gets it, and the other half doesn't, why am I doing whole group? I don't understand. Why are you doing? This half gets it. They don't need you right now. Give them an assignment, the extension assignment, the next step, wherever you're going, let them go. And then grab the other half and do that. Now that is a culture shift, because there's this weird pressure that all kids have to be doing the same thing and all kids have to be on the same path. No, you have to move away from that. And that's especially true in project-based learning, because for example, if I assess and those kids get it, I'm gonna have them let free to work on their products at that moment. Go, you know this guy, go. Make your graphs in your presentation, go now. And then these other kids, you're not ready, and that's okay, come with me. That's great. You're actually creating more time now. You're working with these kids, and these kids are free to continue the work. So really think about this. It actually works better for you, and it's going to be more engaging for kids because kids are getting the instruction they need. They actually will find it relevant now because they understand they don't need it. So actually, it is an empowering thing to differentiate for kids. Some other things to do, and this relates to this whole how do we create feedback to cause thinking, is again, use tools like prompts, cues, and questions, which I think are powerful tools, to get kids to engage in learning. Prompts, cues, and questions. I'm going to give you some examples here. Prompts, cues, and questions cause thinking in students. They don't just do the thinking for them. kids actually have learned helplessness. This is actually kind of true, I would say, maybe a lot in elementary especially, because you know how it is, they just love you and Mr., I got this, is this right, is this right, is this right, right? Like that type of attitude, because they're all about, to be honest, they look to just to please the fact that you're the teacher, and they love that affirmation. But sometimes actually we may be doing a disservice to students by just giving them the answers, because we're creating this learned helplessness, as in I don't really need to learn any of this because my teacher will help me. I don't have any control of this because my teacher will help me. I don't need to have any control of this because my teacher will help me. So how do you use prompts, cues, and questions to help students out? Let me give you an example. So traditionally in a class, we might ask this question: what is photosynthesis, right? Normal thing to ask. And then the student goes, and they raise their hand, and you go, and they go, this what is, it's how plants gain energy. And you're like, yes, I am the best teacher in the world. That student gets it. Give me an award, right? We feel really good about that. And then we go, great. And then you move on to a new question. You say, so what are the plants that we studied in this unit, guys? And they say, we did this one, this one. Actually, we may be doing something wrong there. Here's how that happens. What is photosynthesis? It's how plants gain energy. Good. Even though the student got it right, you need to dig deeper. You need to dig deeper. If you don't, then who knows what they really know. This is a danger, and I've fallen into this trap, right? So ask a question like this, well, tell me more about that. Well, so how does the sun, right? How does the plant create the energy from the sun? How does that work? How does that work? Oh, well, it gets it from the roots. Misconception there, right? Oh, it doesn't quite, it's not wrong, but it's not right. There's a little bit. So that tells me, I better do something. I'd like to mention this is something on the spot, a conversation with students. I'm not writing this down. This is that on the spot empowering assessment for students. So then, now that I know the student doesn't know, okay, so what do I need to do? Well, I'm going to give a student a prompt or a cue. Actually, this is a prompt probing for background knowledge, right? Do you remember that thing? You know, I'm thinking of the diagram you just did earlier about photosynthesis. We filled that out together. Remember that? That was a little while ago. Remember that? So what are you noticing about how the plant uses the sun's, and what are you seeing? And then the kid goes, no. Okay, I don't mean just the stuff comes in the roots. See how that worked there? I'm actually prompting and cueing the students to think and process and correct their errors rather than me just saying, no, you're wrong. Or just to accept a great answer. This is what I call masterful teaching. Anytime somebody does something like this, I get gleeful in the classroom, because it's that masterful knowing the student, doing an on-the-spot assessment, not doing the thinking for them, but probing and questioning to get the student to go, and process, and the wheels are turning. So use prompts, background knowledge prompts, as in remember the thing we've learned. Maybe process prompts, like you're going to want to try that step again, or I want you to look back at step 4 of the lab. What is the first step that we do whenever we go into the lab? What's that thing that we do? Maybe a task, maybe they're not quite following the task or following the directions. You can say a prompt on that. Say, you know what, why don't you try looking at the criteria one more time and see how it is. Again, these are all prompts, not doing it for them. They're empowered to actually learn through the process. Let's say a student, even after that prompting and cueing questioning, they're still going down the wrong path. Okay, we're headed for a crash here, and I really need to redirect the student. You may need to cue them. And by that I mean you're shifting the attention. They're going this way, you need them to go that way. And so you go, okay, we need to stop. Actually, what I need you to do is I need you to open page 4 in the textbook, and I want you to reread that section just one more time for me. Can you go do that? Because I think that might help really clarify something here, okay? I'm taking them and going, woo, and I'm moving them to the side, right? And again, it shows that whole idea of that you are a master of the content, but they may not be, but you're also showing a thought process that when you get it wrong, this is what I would do. Now, because we don't have time, I'm not going to be able to do this role play, but I want to encourage everyone to think about how they might do something like this. And you can do this with your staff, or teachers can do this with each other. I think it's actually a really great practice tool in a non-threatening way to practice role-playing, prompting, cueing, and questioning. So you'll see on this sheet right here, I've created 4 scenarios in a classroom where a teacher asks a student a question and a student doesn't quite get it or something's getting in the way. And then what I would have you do is think about how would you probe and question and prompt somebody to do that. So if you want to do this later, this is a great tool to do that in a staff meeting, for example, to practice like being a silly student who doesn't get something that's kind of fun, but also being the teacher and trying to get the student to move in the right direction. Like I said, these are not skills that many of us got when we first jumped into teaching. Like it's not something that somebody ever says to us, try to learn how to do this. It's not something anybody ever said to me in my teaching career. But now that I've read about it, and now now that I do it more, I know I do it sometimes. I used to, but also I really need to do more of it because this is the kind of feedback that empowers kids to own the learning and not do it for them. So consider doing a role play on this a little later. So the last couple points I want to make around this is that the whole point around this empowering thing is that instruction is linked to these formative assessments. Some of that instruction, I think we need to think big around that word instruction. By instruction, I don't mean just a direct instruction lesson. It could be going to the lab, it could be reading something, and it can also be, just like I demonstrated there, prompting, cueing, and questioning. That is instruction. That is great instruction. You are pulling out from the kids what they don't know, and you're getting them to think. So it's got to be linked to those formative assessments. Anytime you check for understanding, there's got to be some sort of link to what the next steps are for a teacher. And that's really what we call the feed forward in this. Like, where are we going? What are we doing? What do I need to do next? And it's actually going to allow you to work smarter for students in a PBL project. Again, like I said, we're always worried about time. This is a way to use our time smarter and also create the time for projects to happen. I know we have a whole year of curriculum to cover, but we also know that the coverage model is not the way we want to go. So we've got to think about, well, if that's the case, how do I create time and use assessment to have kids really own the learning? So here are some reflection questions today I want to pose to you. What is something you heard today that affirms something you already do well as an instructor, or just a concept that you totally believe in? What is something you heard today that you're challenged by? And then what is your feed forward? As in, what are you going to do next in your classroom? What's something that you're going to go and you're going to take away and say, you know what, I am going to try this out? Go ahead and talk about that now. Affirmations, challenges, and feed forwards. Go ahead. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. I'm hearing some great conversations. I want you to continue with these conversations after we officially end the live stream. Again, you're not going to be able to do this all overnight. Okay, you're not going to leave here and go, I'm going to do all these formative assessments, and I'm going to do prompting and cueing, and I'm not going to grade things, and I'm not going to write feedback. I know that. We're not going to be able to make a major, like this drastic, epic change. But think about maybe one thing that you heard today that you really want to try out. Maybe it is, I'm going to try not to grade by formative assessment. I'm really going to try. Or maybe it's, I'm going to test out this prompting cueing thing. I'm kind of wondering. Or maybe you want to try out the error analysis. Maybe you're like, I kind of dig this. I kind of want to do it. So think about one thing that you can change, because any of these changes are going to help you work smarter for your kids and actually get your kids to own the learning more than you are. So again, related to that, I want to share one last important quote with you, because I think it has to do with PBL. I think every student deserves an opportunity to make mistakes and fail, learn from that opportunity, and move forward. I think every child deserves that. And I believe that truly in project-based learning. Every kid should be able to try something out in their projects, be okay with making mistakes, and come up with the best product through great feedback and assessment. So thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much to Andrew for sharing in such thoughtful, engaging ways all this information and dialogue, thoughtfulness, connections about formative assessment. So hopefully you've been able to make some connections with what we've talked about and thought about here today with our practice in schools. And it's our wish for all of us that we will have the conditions to be able to have some time to think and reflect and learn as we refine our craft throughout the year in joyful ways. Have a good afternoon.